The room did not explode. It didn't erupt in applause or outrage. Instead, it froze. Cameras kept rolling, red lights blinking like silent witnesses, as translators hesitated, unsure whether to continue or stop. In that pause, something rare happened on an international stage. Jasmine Crockett spoke a single sentence, calm and unarmed, yet powerful enough to cut through decades of noise. It wasn't loud. It wasn't rehearsed for viral glory. It was human. Across the table, President Ibrahim Traoré stiffened. For a brief second, the discipline of a head of state held firm. Then his eyes changed. Moisture gathered. His jaw tightened. A man accustomed to carrying the weight of a nation suddenly looked like someone carrying the weight of history. No insults had been thrown. No accusations hurled. And yet the impact landed harder than any confrontation ever could. The audience sensed it immediately. You could feel the air thicken, the collective realization that something unscripted had just broken through protocol. This was not supposed to be the moment. American officials were expected to lecture. African leaders were expected to endure. That had been the pattern for generations. But Crockett's words didn't dominate or diminish. They acknowledged, and in doing so, they disrupted the hierarchy everyone else had silently accepted. Traoré lowered his gaze, blinking slowly, as if grounding himself. The emotion wasn't weakness. It was recognition. Recognition that someone from the world's most powerful country had spoken not down to him, not about him, but to him. A sentence that carried respect instead of suspicion. Humanity instead of instruction. In that instant, the cameras captured something politics usually edits out. Vulnerability without shame. Viewers watching later would replay the clip again and again, asking the same question. How could one sentence do that? How could a moment so quiet feel so seismic? Because beneath the calm delivery was a truth rarely voiced in rooms like this, a truth that reached past borders and titles and landed squarely on lived experience. And as the silence stretched, heavier than any applause, one thing became unmistakably clear. This moment did not come out of nowhere. To understand why those words mattered so deeply, we have to rewind to the forces, the histories, and the unlikely paths that placed these two figures face to face at that exact moment. And what led here was never accidental, simple, or safely contained by anyone. This moment was never written into the script of global politics. For decades, the relationship between the United States and Africa followed an unspoken choreography. One side advised, evaluated, and corrected. The other listened, endured, and waited. Respect was conditional. Validation was rare. African leaders were discussed in policy rooms, not affirmed on equal footing, especially not by American lawmakers in public view. Burkina Faso's rise under Ibrahim Traoré unsettled that arrangement. He represented a generation unwilling to inherit silence, a leadership style that spoke openly about sovereignty, extraction, and dignity. To some, he was dangerous not because of what he threatened, but because of what he refused to accept. The old posture expected compliance, not confidence, distance, not dialogue, and certainly not emotional acknowledgement. That was the real tension in the room long before Jasmine Crockett spoke. Diplomats anticipated friction. Analysts predicted ideological sparring. The expectation was subtle hostility wrapped in formal language, a clash of values disguised as procedure. Everyone assumed the moment would reinforce hierarchy, not question it. That assumption was the system protecting itself, because public validation changes everything. When an American Congresswoman recognizes an African leader's humanity and struggle, it disrupts more than decorum. It punctures the illusion of superiority that power quietly relies on. Respect, when given freely, exposes how rarely it has been offered. And once seen, that absence becomes impossible to ignore. The danger wasn't offense. It was precedent. If dignity could be expressed without permission, what else might follow? What if African leadership was no longer framed as a problem to manage, but as a voice to hear? These are questions institutions are trained to avoid because they weaken control without raising their voice. Inside that room, seasoned officials sensed a shift immediately. This was not confrontation, but something far more destabilizing. It was empathy where dominance was expected, calm where tension had been rehearsed. The kind of moment that leaves power structures unsure how to respond, because nothing was technically violated, yet everything felt exposed. For viewers watching later, the exchange seemed almost gentle, but those who understood the stakes knew how rare it was. This was not just dialogue. It was a quiet refusal to play a role assigned decades ago. And the most unsettling part was how effortlessly it happened. Because at the center of that old system, behind the polished language and practiced restraint, stood forces that never imagined they would be revealed without being directly challenged. The antagonist in this story does not have a single face, a single name, or a single microphone. It is a system, polished and self-assured, that learned long ago how to speak with confidence while never truly listening. A system that presents itself as rational, benevolent, and orderly, even as it decides which nations are worthy of respect and which must earn it endlessly. This is the force that hovered over the room, unseen yet dominant, long before any words were exchanged. For generations, Western political power perfected a language of control disguised as concern. African sovereignty was acknowledged in theory, but questioned in practice. Leaders were described as unstable, emotional, or unprepared, while the consequences of foreign intervention were framed as unfortunate side effects rather than deliberate outcomes. The speeches sounded refined. The policies looked neutral. But the lived reality on the ground told a harsher story, one rarely centered in the conversation. This system thrives on hierarchy. It requires a clear distinction between those who advise and those who are advised, those who evaluate and those who are evaluated. Authority flows in one direction, while accountability diffuses into abstraction. When African leaders spoke about dignity, history, or self-determination, their words were often filtered through suspicion. Were they being too radical, too emotional, too defiant? The same traits celebrated elsewhere were reframed as liabilities here. Media narratives became the system's most effective amplifier. Complex movements were reduced to instability. Resistance was labeled threat. Leadership that refused alignment was painted as reckless. Ibrahim Traoré, like many before him, was discussed more than he was heard. His motives dissected, his legitimacy debated, his humanity rarely explored. The story was never about understanding, only classification. What made the system powerful was not its volume, but its certainty. It spoke as if it had already learned all necessary lessons, as if history had ended with its own dominance. Power without humility leaves no room for reflection. Authority without listening mistakes compliance for respect. Influence without empathy cannot recognize the damage it causes, because it never pauses long enough to feel it. And yet, systems like this rely on predictability. They assume their roles will be accepted, their cues followed. They expect African leaders to defend themselves and American officials to assert guidance. They underestimate moments of sincerity because sincerity does not fit neatly into their framework. It cannot be managed or redirected once released. That miscalculation is where tension begins to build, because beneath the polished language and diplomatic rituals lies a fragile truth. Arrogance requires silence from others to survive. It needs people to internalize dismissal, to doubt their own authority, to shrink themselves to fit expectations. When that silence breaks, even gently, the imbalance becomes visible. The frustration audiences feel comes from recognizing this pattern too well, seeing power exercised without accountability, watching lived experience be sidelined in favor of abstract talking points. The moral tension grows because the system never announces itself as the villain. It insists it is necessary, inevitable, even helpful. But its consequences tell another story. In that room, the system assumed it would speak for everyone, as it always had. It did not anticipate being bypassed rather than confronted. It did not expect clarity without aggression, respect without submission, and most of all, it never imagined that two figures it had quietly underestimated would expose its limits without ever naming it directly. This is why the system reacts so defensively when challenged, even indirectly. It senses erosion before collapse, weakness before exposure. Its confidence depends on being unquestioned, on moving through rooms with the assumption that it defines reason itself. When someone refuses to adopt its tone or mirror its posture, the system feels destabilized, not because it's been attacked, but because it's been ignored. The reckoning audiences anticipate is not loud or theatrical. It is internal. It builds as people recognize how often authority has been mistaken for wisdom, how frequently empathy was dismissed as naivety, how consistently those closest to the consequences were kept furthest from the conversation. The anger is quiet, but it sharpens, driven by the awareness that this imbalance was maintained not by inevitability, but by habit. And habits, once exposed, begin to lose their power. Every polished statement, every carefully worded briefing, depended on the belief that no one would interrupt the pattern. That belief shaped rooms, agendas, and outcomes. It shaped who was trusted and who was doubted before they ever spoke. And once that belief begins to crack, the authority built on it can no longer stand unquestioned. It waits for a moment so subtle that power does not recognize a threat until it is already irreversible and fully undeniable. But history has a way of preparing unlikely voices to break silence when it matters most. Jasmine Crockett did not arrive in that room by accident, and she did not arrive unprepared. Her voice, steady and deliberate, was shaped long before cameras and committees, in spaces where being heard required precision rather than volume. She learned early that power rarely listens to noise, but always notices clarity. That lesson followed her through classrooms, courtrooms, and communities where injustice was not theoretical, but daily, intimate, and personal. Her roots grounded her in contradiction. Growing up in America meant believing in its promises while constantly confronting its failures. She understood what it meant to love a country that did not always love you back, to believe in democracy while watching access to it unevenly distributed. That tension did not harden her. It sharpened her. It taught her that dignity is not something granted by institutions, but something claimed through persistence and truth. Crockett's advocacy was never performative. She built her reputation by listening before speaking, by mastering systems designed to exclude, and then using that knowledge to expose their blind spots. In rooms where others postured, she asked precise questions. In debates where emotions ran high, she remained controlled, not because she lacked feeling, but because she understood the discipline required to make feeling matter. Fearlessness, for her, did not mean recklessness. It meant refusing to be intimidated into silence. Those who underestimated her often made the same mistake. They mistook calm for caution, empathy for softness. They did not see the steel beneath the composure. Forged by years of navigating spaces where her presence was questioned before her ideas ever were. She learned how to speak in a way that could not be dismissed without revealing the dismissiveness itself. That skill became her quiet advantage. Her understanding of injustice extended beyond borders. As someone attuned to the global echoes of power and marginalization, she recognized familiar patterns in international politics. The language used to talk about distant nations often mirrored the language used to talk about marginalized communities at home. Both relied on abstraction, distance, and control. Both avoided acknowledging lived experience as expertise. Crockett noticed these parallels because she had lived them. This is what gave her sensitivity to dignity on a global stage. She did not see African leadership as an anomaly to be explained, but as humanity to be respected. Her perspective was shaped by solidarity rather than superiority. She knew what it felt like to have your legitimacy debated by people untouched by the consequences of their judgments. That knowledge informed not only what she said, but how she said it. When she spoke, she did not perform outrage. She practiced intention. Every word was measured, chosen not for effect, but for accuracy. The sentence that would later ripple across the world was not improvised in emotion. It was assembled from memory, from history, from countless moments when acknowledgement was withheld and harm followed. It carried the weight of someone who understood that recognition can heal what policy alone cannot. In that room, her authority was earned, not assumed. It came from consistency, from showing up with preparation when others relied on position. She was not there to dominate the conversation, but to recalibrate it. Her presence alone unsettled expectations, because she did not fit the mold assigned to her. She refused to be boxed into either deference or defiance. Instead, she chose respect with clarity. There is an underdog energy that emerges when someone has spent years being underestimated. It creates a quiet confidence, an awareness that power often misjudges where truth will come from. Crockett carried that awareness with her, not as bitterness, but as resolve. She understood that moments like this rarely announce themselves. They appear suddenly, demanding readiness rather than rehearsal. She had prepared for moments like this in ways few ever saw. By studying history not as nostalgia, but as warning. By listening to elders, activists, and everyday people whose stories never reach official transcripts. By internalizing the lesson that justice spoken too late becomes apology. She knew timing was not about speed, but about alignment, about recognizing when silence would do more harm than speech. That understanding guided her restraint and sharpened her courage in equal measure. That readiness was visible even before she spoke. Her posture, her timing, her restraint signaled intention. She knew exactly who she was addressing, and she knew the history standing between them. Her words were shaped by that understanding, by the knowledge that respect, when offered sincerely, can do what confrontation cannot. They were deeply personal, not because they centered her, but because they carried her lived understanding of what it means to be seen. In moments like this, power often reveals who it never expected to fear, not because of force, but because of clarity, not because of volume, but because of truth delivered without apology. Crockett understood that recognition, once spoken aloud, cannot be taken back. It changes the terms of engagement forever. What the system failed to recognize was that her power did not come from disruption, but from recognition. She did not need to raise her voice to shift the room. She only needed to speak the truth she had been carrying for years, waiting for the moment when it would land exactly where it was needed, alone and unacknowledged for years. And across the room sat a man carrying the weight of an entire nation. Ibrahim Traoré did not become a symbol by chasing one. He inherited at the moment he stepped into leadership, carrying expectations heavier than any uniform could show. To millions of young Africans, his rise represented interruption, a break in the rhythm of leaders who spoke carefully while nothing changed. He was seen not as perfection, but as possibility. Someone young enough to remember what had been promised, and brave enough to ask why it never arrived. Burkina Faso is a nation long discussed in foreign briefings, footnotes, and security analyses, but rarely addressed with genuine curiosity. Decisions about its future were often made elsewhere, narrated by voices far removed from its streets, farms, and classrooms. Traoré understood that reality intimately. Leadership for him meant standing between external expectations and internal wounds, absorbing pressure from every direction while appearing unshaken. Inside, the burden was relentless. He carried the memory of history that never fully loosened its grip, of extraction framed as partnership, of intervention framed as assistance. Every speech he gave was weighed against suspicion, every decision scrutinized for alignment. He learned quickly that sovereignty invited punishment as often as praise. The exhaustion was not physical alone, but emotional, the fatigue of defending legitimacy that should never require defense. Yet resilience shaped him, not the loud, theatrical kind, but the quiet endurance of someone who knows retreat would only confirm what others already assume. Hope existed, but it was restrained, tempered by the knowledge that optimism without vigilance invites betrayal. He represented a generation raised on the aftermath of broken promises, determined not to inherit silence as their only option. Young people across Africa saw themselves in him because he reflected their contradictions, pride mixed with frustration, courage paired with caution, the desire to move forward while carrying unresolved grief. To them, he was proof that leadership could still feel familiar, still speak their language, still acknowledge their anger without exploiting it. That connection made him powerful, but it also made him vulnerable. Traoré was aware of how the world looked at him. He recognized the assumptions layered over his presence before he ever spoke. He knew respect was conditional, often temporary, always fragile. Walking into international rooms meant bracing for dismissal disguised as diplomacy. He prepared for lectures, for subtle warnings, for conversations that spoke around him rather than with him. What he did not prepare for was recognition. Not applause, not endorsement, but acknowledgement without agenda. The kind that does not demand performance or compliance in return. That absence of expectation caught him off guard, because it touched something rarely addressed in leaders expected to remain immovable. Leadership isolates. It requires emotional discipline that borders on erasure. Public strength becomes survival, even when private fatigue accumulates. Traoré had learned to contain reaction, to translate feeling into resolve, to never let vulnerability become spectacle. His composure was armor, necessary and heavy. Even in silence, his presence carried consequence. He measured rooms instinctively, noting who leaned forward and who withdrew. Years of navigating unequal exchanges had trained him to read subtext as carefully as statements. He knew which smiles signaled patience and which masked warning. This awareness kept him alert, never fully at ease, even in moments meant to symbolize cooperation. The cost of leadership revealed itself in these small calculations, repeated endlessly, rarely acknowledged. Each appearance required balance between firmness and restraint, pride and diplomacy. Too much confidence invited backlash. Too much caution invited erasure. Holding that line demanded constant emotional labor, invisible to observers but heavy nonetheless. He accepted it because the alternative, silence, felt like surrender. Still, there were moments when the armor pressed inward, when the weight of representing millions left little space for personal release, moments when recognition, if it ever came, would land with unexpected force and reshape everything he thought he understood beforehand. When exchange finally began, no one expected emotion to overpower protocol. The exchange began the way everyone expected it to. Formal language, measured pacing, the familiar rhythm of international conversation where nothing truly dangerous is supposed to be said. Voices moved carefully, each sentence weighed for consequence. Traoré listened, expression neutral, posture disciplined, absorbing words that sounded polished but distant. He had heard versions of them before, in rooms just like this, from people just like this. Then Jasmine Crockett spoke. She did not interrupt. She did not challenge. She waited until the space naturally opened, until the room leaned forward without realizing it. Her tone was steady, almost conversational, but something about it shifted the air. The translator slowed, sensing that precision mattered now more than speed. Cameras tightened their focus. The room did not yet know why, only that something different was unfolding. Her sentence arrived without flourish. 12 words, delivered calmly, without accusation or praise. They did not instruct. They did not evaluate. They acknowledged. In those few seconds, she removed Traoré from the abstract language of policy and placed him back into the realm of human experience. She recognized the history that shaped him, the burden he carried, and the dignity that persisted despite it. It was not validation of power. It was recognition of personhood. The effect was immediate and unmistakable. Traoré's eyes shifted first, not away, but inward. The practiced stillness he had perfected over years of leadership faltered. His breathing changed, subtle but visible. The armor he wore so instinctively hesitated, as if unsure whether it was still needed. He blinked once, then again, slower this time, as the weight of the words settled somewhere deeper than protocol could reach. Around them, silence expanded. Chairs remained still. Pens hovered above paper. No one moved to fill the space, because no one knew how. This was not a pause meant for response. It was a pause caused by recognition, landing where it had long been absent. The room felt exposed, stripped of its usual insulation. Traoré's composure did not collapse dramatically. It cracked quietly. His jaw tightened, not in defiance, but restraint. His eyes glossed, betraying an emotion rarely allowed to surface in rooms like this. It was not sadness alone. It was relief, grief, gratitude, and exhaustion converging all at once. For a moment, he was not performing leadership. He was feeling it. The cameras captured everything. The slight nod, as if acknowledging something unsaid for generations. The way his gaze lowered, then steadied, as he gathered himself. This was not weakness. It was a release of attention held too long, the recognition that someone had finally spoken to him rather than around him. No one rushed to interpret the moment because interpretation felt intrusive. The old narrative, built on dominance and distance, had no language for what was happening. There was no confrontation to analyze, no aggression to condemn, only truth, offered without demand, dismantling assumptions simply by existing. This was how the system unraveled, not through force, but through clarity it could not absorb. The hierarchy depended on emotional distance. Crockett closed that distance in a single sentence. The imbalance became visible, and once seen, it could not be unseen. Power without humility suddenly looked small. Authority without listening looked fragile. Traoré finally looked up. His eyes met hers, and in that exchange, something shifted irreversibly. There was acknowledgement there, mutual and unspoken. She had named what history tried to erase. He had felt it, fully and publicly. The room, bound by etiquette, could only witness. Those watching understood instinctively that they were seeing something rare. A leader allowed to be human. An American official choosing respect over posture. The absence of theatrics made the moment heavier, not lighter. Silence became confirmation. Nothing more needed to be said. The sentence had already done its work. And what followed next didn't stay in that room. It exploded across the world. The clip did not crawl across the internet. It detonated. Within minutes, timelines flooded with the same frozen frame, the same pause, the same glassed eyes. People shared it without captions because none were needed. Comment sections filled faster than context ever could. Viewers wrote that they felt something shift in their chest, something they could not name. Screens became gathering places where disbelief turned into recognition, and recognition turned into urgency, demanding that everyone watch. Across platforms, algorithms struggled to keep up as reposts multiplied, and the moment escaped control completely. Everywhere conversations ignited instantly, without warning, at scale. In Africa, the response carried a different weight. Young people reposted the clip with flags, hearts, and quiet pride. They said it felt like being seen by a world that usually spoke over them. Elders shared it with commentary about history finally acknowledged aloud. Diaspora communities echoed the sentiment, recognizing the familiar ache of invisibility and the rare relief of respect. The moment crossed borders easily because the emotion already lived everywhere. It traveled faster than explanations, carried by feeling rather than politics alone. That distinction mattered deeply to millions watching, across time zones simultaneously. In shared awe, together now. In the United States, reactions fracture along familiar lines. Supporters praise Crockett for choosing humanity over hierarchy, calling her words brave and overdue. Clips circulated of people pausing videos just to collect themselves. Many said they had never witnessed an American official speak that way on a global stage. It felt disruptive without being hostile, powerful without dominance. For some, it restored a sense of moral authority they feared had vanished. That reaction spread quietly, then loudly, reshaping conversations across progressive spaces, online and offline alike, in classrooms, homes, and organizing meetings everywhere, at once, without delay or hesitation. Anywhere, critics scrambled to regain control of the narrative. Some dismissed the moment as performative. Others warned it was inappropriate or naive. But their responses sounded thin, rushed, and disconnected from what people actually felt. Attempts to reframe the exchange as weakness failed because the emotion was undeniable. The usual talking points could not contain a reaction built on recognition. The system struggled to translate sincerity into scandal. Each rebuttal revealed more insecurity than insight, amplifying the original impact. People noticed the imbalance immediately, and they rejected the deflection instinctively. It rang hollow everywhere, across political spectrums. In real time, globally, young viewers reframed the moment entirely. They did not debate policy details or strategic outcomes. They focused on feeling, on respect, on what leadership could look like if empathy guided it. For a generation raised on skepticism, the clip felt clarifying. Power did not have to humiliate to be effective. Strength did not require erasure. The exchange offered a new grammar for politics, one rooted in acknowledgement. It circulated as proof that tone can transform meaning instantly. That lesson resonated far beyond ideology, shared widely in comments and remixes, by millions watching, across continents simultaneously, without translation barriers. At scale, for immigrant communities, the moment struck even closer. It mirrored conversations they had waited to hear in spaces that rarely invited them. Seeing respect extended across borders affirmed identities often questioned at home. Pride surfaced not as nationalism, but as dignity recognized. The clip became a shared reference point, a reminder that visibility can arrive unexpectedly and change how belonging feels overnight. People message each other simply saying, "Watch this, trust me." That simplicity carried profound weight. It bypassed debate and went straight to recognition, something many had rarely experienced publicly, especially at that level, in power spaces. Before then, commentators tried to explain why it mattered, but explanations lagged behind emotion. The narrative was already shifting beneath them. Moral authority moved subtly, away from dominance toward recognition. Viewers felt empowered to demand more of leaders, not louder speeches, but deeper awareness. The clip became a measuring stick, exposing how hollow so much global dialogue had been until now. It raised expectations without issuing instructions or ultimatums. That subtlety made it powerful. People sensed a recalibration underway, slow, irreversible, and shared, across movements, cultures, and ages, without coordination or command, just collective recognition, spreading organically everywhere, at unprecedented speed, globally. As the clip continued to circulate, one realization settled in. This was no longer about a sentence or a single exchange. It was about what happens when dignity interrupts routine. The viral moment marked an inflection point, not loud enough to announce itself, but strong enough to endure. And beyond the screens, beyond the applause and backlash, something deeper had changed. People sensed it even if they could not articulate it yet. The ground beneath old narratives felt unstable. Quietly, expectations recalibrated everywhere. In politics, identity and belonging, without permission or approval, simply through recognition, that refused containment any longer. Moments like this remind us that power is not only measured in speeches, votes, or military might. True influence is quieter, harder to define, and far more enduring. It is a kind that does not demand compliance or obedience, but instead asks only that people be recognized as human beings. Empathy, when wielded courageously, can dismantle centuries of hierarchy that relied on distance, dismissal, and disregard. It exposes a fragile architecture of dominance and reminds us that authority without understanding is temporary at best, hollow at worst. Jasmine Crockett's words did not shout. They did not challenge through force or spectacle. They invited acknowledgement. They reminded a world accustomed to framing African leadership as problem rather than partner that dignity cannot be manufactured. It must be seen, it must be honored, and when honored, it transforms the space around it. Respect became revolutionary because it contradicted expectations, unsettled assumptions, and shifted the conversation without raising a fist or a voice. Leadership, then, reveals itself not in the loudest declaration, but in the courage to speak truth where it has been withheld. Traoré's response, a rare public vulnerability, reminded the world that strength is not absence of feeling, but the capacity to carry responsibility with integrity. Patriotism is not the blind defense of power structures, but the defense of values that elevate all citizens, that recognize shared humanity as the measure of a nation's worth. In that room, the interplay of words redefined leadership as moral courage, rooted not in dominance, but in clarity, empathy, and recognition. This exchange teaches a lesson far beyond politics. It is a template for engagement in any space where voices are often overlooked. It asks each of us to recognize what is frequently dismissed, to see what is often ignored, and to speak when acknowledgement is overdue. When respect is intentional, precise, and unyielding in its simplicity, it can disrupt patterns established for generations, forcing institutions and individuals alike to reckon with the human consequences of their assumptions. The emotional resonance of the moment rippled beyond diplomatic halls. For young people watching, it was proof that sincerity, preparation, and courage matter. For marginalized communities, it was validation that their experiences are worth seeing, that their identities can exist in spaces that historically erase them. For leaders everywhere, it was an example of how authority and humility are not opposing forces, but complementary ones, each amplifying the other when exercised with integrity. What emerged from this moment is not merely applause or viral attention. It is a reimagining of how we relate to one another across boundaries of power, geography, and ideology. It is the acknowledgement that the most transformative gestures are sometimes the simplest: a sentence spoken with care, a look exchanged with honesty, a truth acknowledged without hesitation. These gestures accumulate, shaping collective consciousness, guiding future interactions, and slowly rewriting the scripts we unconsciously follow. At its core, this is a story of moral courage meeting opportunity. Crockett's courage was not performative. It was deliberate, cultivated through years of observing injustice, practicing clarity, and respecting the weight of her own voice. Traoré's openness was not weakness. It was a recognition that human leadership requires authenticity as much as strategy. Together, they demonstrated that influence grounded in empathy can outlast any command imposed through fear, authority, or habit. And in that shared recognition, a universal truth emerged. Dignity is contagious. Respect does not diminish. It expands. Humanity acknowledged becomes humanity amplified. Across borders, generations, and political divides, the lesson is the same. When people are seen and treated with authenticity, they respond with integrity, courage, and inspiration in kind. That is how change begins. That is how movements grow. That is how histories are rewritten without a single shout. In the end, what this moment leaves behind is hope. Hope that civility can be radical. Hope that empathy can reshape the balance of power. Hope that recognition, carefully offered and courageously received, can ripple outward, touching lives, shifting narratives, and creating spaces where shared humanity triumphs over hierarchy. It is a call to action as subtle as it's profound. To speak truth, to honor dignity, and to lead with a moral courage that transforms both individuals and nations. Respect, it turns out, is not just ethical. It is revolutionary. One sentence, 12 words, a moment so simple, yet so profound, it reshaped a room, a conversation, and perhaps even how the world views leadership. Jasmine Crockett's words did not just reach Ibrahim Traoré. They reached every viewer who has ever felt overlooked, underestimated, or dismissed. They reminded us that recognition, delivered with clarity and care, can dismantle assumptions and rewrite narratives faster than any decree or directive ever could. Moments like this ask something of us beyond watching. They challenge us to notice humanity where it is often ignored, to speak truth where silence has long prevailed, and to act with courage even when the stakes feel immense. They prove that influence is not always a roar. Sometimes it is a pause, a word, a gesture that commands attention without demanding submission. So pause, reflect, share what you've seen. Comment on the moments in your life or in your communities where dignity, empathy, and courage triumphed over dominance. Recognize the quiet heroes around you, and remember that change often arrives in the smallest packages. A sentence, a choice, a single act of acknowledgement. Subscribe, stay engaged, and let your own voice join the chorus that affirms humanity, because one sentence can change the world.